The Gini coefficient is one way to look at the level of inequality of either income or wealth within a country or across the world. It's not the only way, and in some ways it's not my favorite method because when we're talking about inequality, often what we're talking about is how much power one group has compared to everybody else. And so one way to look at that power and how much it's concentrated within countries is to look at either the fraction of wealth or the fraction of income held by the top 1% or sometimes even the top 0.1 or 0.01%. So in this video, we're going to look at the top 1% of both wealth and income and across countries. And what we'll see is that there have been both increases and decreases in inequality throughout history, um, and that in some ways we're a much more equal society now than compared to the past, and in some ways we are less equal than we used to be. And so we'll see what we mean. So one thing that's important to remember and just recall from earlier videos is the difference between wealth and income. So for wealth, we're talking about things that a person or family or household own, right? So that's going to include the equity you have in your home, any financial wealth you have, any businesses you own, all of that goes into wealth. And wealth is always going to be more unequally distributed than is income, or at least it always has been in the past. Then when we talk about earnings inequality, we can talk about market inequality, the earnings you get before taxes and transfers, or disposable income inequality, which is after taxes and transfers. And most countries, most developed countries, have much more equality in disposable income than in market income. So here we have just three countries, right? We have the United States, which people often talk about as being much less equal, Sweden, where people talk about it being a more equal country, and Japan, which also has a reputation for being more equal. And you can see that for wealth inequality, Sweden is actually even more unequal than the United States. So this is the Gini coefficient for wealth. You can see it's over zero point 0.8 for the United States and it's almost zero point 0.9 for Sweden. Whereas for Japan, it's actually less than 0.6. That's pretty relatively equal when we look at wealth inequality. When we look at earnings inequality before taxes, market income, all three countries are pretty similar, sort of between about 0.43 and 0.48, not huge differences. But there are large differences in inequality in disposable income. So you can see that the United States doesn't do as much as either Sweden or Japan in reducing inequality after taxes and transfers. And Sweden really gets that reputation for being a more equal economy because of the taxes and transfers it puts into place. And so its Gini coefficient after taxes and transfers is only about 0.24, where it's it's about 0.38 for the United States. So one of the benefits of looking at wealth is that we can go back longer in history because of data that's kept about who owns what. And so here we have the share of wealth owned by the top 1% going back as far as 1740 for the United Kingdom, and then sort of picking up in the late 18th or early 19th century for a number of other countries. The United States is in pink, Finland's in red, Norway's in purple, France in green, Denmark in gray, and Sweden in blue. And what you can see is that throughout the 19th century, these places were pretty unequal. The United States was actually more equal than most of the European countries, which isn't that surprising given its foundation. The United Kingdom sort of hit a high point of inequality right around World War One, and it put in a whole after World War One. It put in a whole lot of policies to reduce that wealth inequality, and it was quite successful in doing so. And you can see that wealth inequality is much lower than it has been in by historical standards in basically all of these countries. So the share of wealth owned by the top 1% is about 20% in most of these countries. So not as high as it used to be, certainly. This is, sort of the era of nobles and then robber barons and captains of industry. If we look at income, we can't go back as far historically. We can usually go back to somewhere near the beginning of the 20th century. And here we have the United States and the United Kingdom, as we had in the other graph, but now we're adding also South Africa, Argentina, India, and China. And what you can see is that in a lot of countries, inequality was high in the 20s and 30s, so that income going to the top 1% was, about 20% of the income, fell during the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, and then has been increasing again. And so you can see that certainly for the United States, it was around 8% in the 50s and 60s, the so-called golden era of capitalism, but it's now back up to the levels that it was in the 1920s.